Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? I'll take that for a yes. I want to welcome everyone to today's press conference. I'm very pleased that you're all able to connect remotely and be here to discuss DOI's report on our investigation into the New York City Police Department's response to the protests that occurred across the city in the wake of the May 25th killing of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer. For the last 6 months, DOI has been conducting an independent investigation into the New York City Police Department's response to these protests. Because individual misconduct investigations of police officers are primarily the responsibility of the CCRB and NYPD's Internal Affairs Bureau, because nearly all of those investigations are ongoing, and because I believed it did not serve the broader goal of police accountability to interfere with those investigations, DOI focused its investigative efforts on assessing the NYPD's protest response at an institutional and systemic level. To conduct this investigation, we reviewed thousands of pages of NYPD records and hundreds of hours of video. We analyzed multiple data sets that might shed light on the protests and on the NYPD's response. We conducted dozens of interviews, including with the NYPD's senior leadership, and an extensive review of publicly available evidence, including from social media and from the press. My team at DOI embarked on this project this summer, knowing its importance to the city and to the people who live here. Those 2 weeks in late May and early June were a very painful period in an already deeply challenging year for New York City. Our goal was to bring transparency and accountability to the events of that period, and to do so by following the facts without fear or favor. I'm very proud of the report we are releasing today, which I believe is balanced, fair, and tells hard but necessary truths. Policing is a vital service, and its success depends heavily on public trust and legitimacy, a belief on the part of the people that the police exercise rightful authority and that they do so in a way that is fair and just. As I will detail in a moment, aspects of the NYPD's response to the Floyd protests undermine this trust and their own legitimacy. I hope that this report and its recommendations can begin to set the police department and the city down a path together of meaningful reform. The Floyd protests were unprecedented in their scope and scale and presented an extraordinary policing challenge for the NYPD. Most of the protests in New York City were peaceful, but some led to violent confrontations between the police and protesters, which included both violence and property destruction by some protesters, as well as widespread allegations that the police had used excessive tactics against New Yorkers exercising their First Amendment rights. The problems went beyond poor judgment or misconduct by some individual officers. Our investigation found that the NYPD as an institution made a number of key errors or omissions that likely escalated tensions and the potential for violence, and certainly contributed to the public perception that the department was suppressing rather than facilitating lawful First Amendment assembly and expression. Our investigation found that the NYPD's response was deficient in 6 key ways. First, the NYPD lacked a clearly defined strategy tailored to respond to large-scale protests of police and policing. The size, scope, and intensity of protests across the city came as a surprise to the leadership of the police department, and this translated into initial understaffing and then falling back on disorder control tactics and methods without adjustment to reflect their responsibility for facilitating lawful First Amendment expression. Second, the NYPD's use of force and certain crowd control tactics to respond to the protests produced excessive enforcement that contributed to heightened tensions. These tactics, which included encirclement, also known as kettling, mass arrests, baton and pepper spray use, and other tactics, reflected a failure to calibrate an appropriate balance between valid public safety or officer safety interests and the rights of protesters to assemble and to express their views. The inconsistent application of the curfew similarly generated legitimate public concerns about selective enforcement. The NYPD's tactics often failed to discriminate between lawful peaceful protesters and unlawful actors. Third, we found that some policing decisions relied on intelligence without sufficient consideration of context or proportionality. Though some of the intelligence gathering pertained to generalized threats based on information from jurisdictions outside of New York City, The NYPD also collected specific intelligence that warranted consideration in making police judgments with respect to particular protest events. However, intelligence alone does not necessarily dictate a particular police response. In the case of the Mott Haven protest on June 4th, for example, where NYPD had specific intelligence that may have warranted heightened concerns, its mass arrest of protesters for curfew violations in the absence of evidence of actual violence was disproportionate to the circumstances. Fourth, the NYPD deployed officers who lacked sufficient or sufficiently recent training on policing protests. With the exception of officers in specialized units, most officers responding to the protests had not received recent relevant training for policing protests. Indeed, many had not received relevant training since they graduated the police academy. After the Floyd protests, the police commissioner directed all officers to take additional training relating to policing protests. However, the training remains heavily focused on disorder control methods without a sufficient community affairs or de-escalation component. Fifth, the NYPD lacked a centralized community affairs strategy for the Floyd protests. The Community Affairs Bureau was not part of the planning or the strategy for policing the protests. Though individual precinct-level community affairs officers were present at certain protests, their deployment was left to the discretion of borough commanders, who also could use those officers in a patrol or enforcement capacity. Sixth, the NYPD lacked a sufficient data collection system to track relevant protest data. The NYPD lacks a reliable, consistent method to capture the relevant data, including the total number of protest-related arrests and other relevant information about them. These data issues pose challenges for transparency and accountability. The report calls on the NYPD to change its overall approach to responding to mass protests and to ensure that its tactics and strategy do not stifle First Amendment assembly. The report outlines how a different approach can facilitate First Amendment expression, while also more effectively protecting public safety and officer safety. I believe the findings of this investigation and our recommendations for reform can be part of an ongoing effort to advance policing in this city and towards improving community trust in the NYPD. DOI issued 20 detailed recommendations to the NYPD to improve their response to policing protests, including, among others, creating a protest response unit to lead the planning and strategy for response to large protests that would collaborate with the Community Affairs Bureau on community engagement and coordinate with other divisions, borough commands, and precincts on response. Drafting a patrol guide policy specific to policing protests and protected First Amendment activity, and consulting on this policy with individuals and entities outside of the NYPD, including civil rights attorneys, community organizations, and police reform experts. We make several recommendations specifically directed at the use of specialized units and disorder control tactics. We make recommendations to improve training on protest policing, and recommendations regarding the integrated involvement of community affairs in protest policing. As part of our investigation, DOI also turned to examine the history and current state of affairs of police oversight in New York City, an issue that also deserves attention in this moment when our city is having an ongoing conversation about reimagining policing. In addition to DOI's own research, review of scholarly literature on civilian oversight, our own experience conducting oversight of the NYPD and other city agencies, we also interviewed individuals who've been involved in various ways with oversight of NYPD over the past 25 years. Based on this review, we identified 5 broad areas of recurring concern in external oversight of the NYPD, which informed our ultimate conclusions and recommendations. Those 5 areas we highlighted included the potential for redundancy, confusion, and conflict among 3 different oversight agencies, the need for community engagement, identifying and addressing perceptions of institutional bias, the challenges in accessing NYPD records, and finally, the effect of oversight recommendations on NYPD policy and programs. Fair and effective policing is vital to public safety, and a key ingredient in that is public confidence that the police are subject to robust oversight. That informed our ultimate recommendation that the mayor and the city council consider consolidating existing police oversight functions into a single agency headed by an independent board. We urge the NYPD leadership to embrace the necessity and the benefits of external oversight. The investigative findings and recommendations laid out in both parts of the report provide a roadmap for the city to improve and reform the NYPD's approach to mass protests in a way that we hope is part of a larger strategy of listening to the community and placing their concerns at the center of policing. I want to recognize and thank the DOI team that has worked incredibly hard to investigate these events and deliver an in-depth report that walks the public through what we found, why we found it, and the resulting recommendations. Before I take your questions, there's one final matter I'd like to address. It is and has always been DOI's standard practice to share advanced copies of its reports with the agency that is the subject of the report and with City Hall so that they are informed about our findings. This is done to enable the agency to request any factual corrections about their own operations and be able to respond thoughtfully to the report's recommendations when it is released publicly. This practice, which again has been followed by DOI for many years, does not change the results of any investigation or compromise our independence. We also notify others of the date and time that we expect to publicly release the report, which in this case was today at 10:30 a.m. As is true of every DOI matter, DOI maintained independent and final control of any fact-finding or recommendations as part of this report, and those facts and recommendations have been made public in the report without influence or interference from any party. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take your questions.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We'll now be accepting your questions. Anyone outside the news media who is joining us can follow up with our Intergovernmental Affairs unit after the press conference, and I'll include contact information in the chat. We know many of you are very familiar with virtual press conferences. However, this is the first for DOI. So we just ask you have some patience with us when we take your questions. We want everyone to get a chance to ask questions, so we'd ask that you please limit yourselves to one question and one follow-up so we can keep things moving along. Once we get to everyone, we can circle back with those who have additional questions. Please use the raise hand feature in the webinar to notify us if you have a question. We will try our best to go in order, but please again have some patience with us. I'll call on you and then unmute your mic to ask your question. Once everyone has had a chance to at least ask one question, we can circle back to reporters who have additional inquiries. Our goal is to get everyone's questions answered, and Diane and I are around after the press conference for any follow-up. We will also monitor the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen, in case you have technical difficulties or for some reason have not been recognized to get your question answered. But we ask that the questions be asked by raising your hand, since that will get you in the queue to be recognized. If you're having trouble accessing the webinar on your microphone and you'd like to ask a question, please email Diane Struzzi. She'll make sure that your question is asked. I'll put her email in the chat as well. With that, we will take our first question from Jake Offenhart.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Great. So I'm looking at the report. It says that no structural proposal can succeed without a commissioner who embraces the necessity of effective civilian oversight and accepts the value of external perspectives. Does DOI believe that Commissioner Shea embraces this necessity of civilian oversight?
I hope that he will.
And if I could just follow up there. I mean, this is a report that you guys spent 6 months on. It doesn't name any of the NYPD leadership or fault them. Was this a conscious choice? And could you just elaborate a little bit more on Commissioner Shea's involvement and cooperation here?
Sure. I guess, Jake, first I take issue with your claim that it doesn't name any of the NYPD leadership or fault them. Actually, throughout the report, we talk about the senior leaders that we interviewed, and we talk about specific positions and decisions that were made by various people. So I don't think that's accurate. I know it's a very dense report, but I think when you have time to read the whole thing, you'll see that that's not accurate. And I think throughout the report, we call to account where we think decisions need to be called to account, and ultimately those are the responsibility of the police commissioner, and I think we make that clear in the report.
Okay, next we have Aaron Durkin.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Erin. Good morning.
Okay, thanks. You actually partially addressed my question at the end of the press conference, but when exactly did you send this report to City Hall? And I guess some of the criticism has been about, you know, de Blasio being able to make a video to have it ready to go after it was provided to us, but before it was put online. Is that sort of the standard procedure?
And this, as I said, the standard procedure is to provide an early copy of the report to the agency that's the subject of any DOI report and to City Hall. The amount of time varies depending on the length and complexity of the report. So, but as to the mayor's statement, I don't know the use of the term allowed. I don't control or direct the mayor's public statements or strategy or any other decision in that regard. So DOI followed its standard practice here, and that's the best I can say.
We have Mark Morales from CNN.
Hello.
Good morning, Mark. How are you?
Good morning. Sorry, I had a little issues here unmuting myself.
That's okay.
Got a couple of questions, but the first one I wanted to ask is, and forgive me if this is in the report and I just missed it, but did you interview anybody at the mayor's office or even the mayor himself? I remember during the time of the protests, he was obviously holding his daily briefings, but it seemed like the mayor was very heavily involved in a lot of the planning that went in. So just wondering if that was ever a consideration or if you guys actually did speak.
So we did interview many people from the community affairs unit at the City Hall who were sort of actively out observing and participating in some cases in the protests. We did not interview the mayor as part of this, although, as you noted, he was making many public statements at the time, which we certainly reviewed.
And it's I guess not indicated by your investigation that he was involved in a lot of the strategy or plannings or even trying to implement any of that, right?
No, we focused on the strategy and planning that was made at the police department. I think one area that we do talk about, the kind of interplay between the mayor and the police department, is when we talk about the decision to implement a curfew and the public messaging around that curfew. And you can find it in the table of contents. I don't have the page right at hand, but we discussed that pretty extensively in the report.
We have Dave Evans from ABC.
Commissioner, can you hear me now?
I can. Good morning, Dave. How are you?
I'm fine. Hey, I wanted to just ask you, you mentioned the June 4th incident in Mott Haven. And of all the incidents that you had to look at, because you had several months here, was that some of the most egregious behavior that you saw? Were there other incidents that were like that? The kettling, the use of violence by the police department? What was your reaction to that? And also, is that the worst example you saw?
Well, I think, what I would say about Mott Haven, and we do talk about it at a number of places in the report, is that one of the reasons we talked about it is that it was in many ways sort of emblematic of a number of factors that came together during these events and that we discuss in the report. And what I mean by that is that really on both sides, in terms of maybe some, what was driving the police department decisions in terms of the intelligence and concerns that they had, but also the way that translated into police action, which in the case of Mott Haven was a decision to essentially at the turn of the curfew arrest a very large number. In fact, I think it was the largest single mass arrest during this time period. And in order to effectuate that, a significant use of force had to be employed in order to arrest, I believe it's over 200 people at once. So I think one of the reasons we focused on that is that it was emblematic of a combination of factors that we identified in the report. And so it certainly stands out for that reason. As we said, we have avoided making specific individualized findings in this report of excessive force or other kinds of legal findings, because those matters, whether it is in disciplinary investigations or other investigations, are ongoing, and our goal was not to interfere with or undermine those investigations.
And just as a different topic, it's been mentioned before, but the video response from the mayor this morning, also the response from the police department, kind of this mea culpa. I just wanted to see your reaction from that. Does that somewhat blunt the impact, the seriousness of this report, or does perhaps it heighten the seriousness and the need to reform the police department?
I'm very proud of the report. We think it's very good and important, and my hope certainly all along is that when we make recommendations or findings, that they will resonate with the agency and with the decision makers who will be responsible for implementing the reform. So in that sense, I'm grateful and happy, given the work that went into this, that right now the police department and the mayor are saying that they accept the findings and intend to implement the recommendations.
We have Greg Smith from the city.
Greg.
Hi. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
I hate technology. Just want to go on the record saying that.
It's a bad time to hate technology, Greg.
Yeah, well, we're all slaves to this stuff. I'm sorry to do this, but I'm going to do my usual historical institutional knowledge thing on this. But this report it was for me deja vu all over again, because this same issue, which is the overuse of excessive force in trying to maintain order or to enforce disorder regarding First Amendment protests, happened almost exactly the same way in the 2004 Republican National Convention. And there were a number of findings about this, the use of kettling, for example. And at any rate, it's the same thing all over again. If that is true, how does this report move us beyond what appears to be baked into the DNA of the New York City Police Department?
Well, I mean, that's a very hard question, Greg. I think you're absolutely right that, it is deja vu all over again in some ways, which is not to say that the police department hasn't made enormous strides in other areas. But here, I think anyone looking at these issues who is familiar with the Republican Convention in 2004, with some aspects of the Occupy protests in 2011 and 2012, would find many of these things to be a familiar refrain. And, I think one of the issues that we identify in terms of the training and even the structure of who in the police department responds to these kinds of things, in terms of forming this highly specialized unit of the strategic response group that is really focused on sort of terrorist incidents, active shooters, rescue situations, riots, that every police commissioner makes a judgment about where to spend resources on training and on structure. And I do think you're right that anyone familiar with the long view can't help but come away with this thinking like that a lot of the learning from those earlier events seems to have fallen by the wayside. So the bigger question you raise, I think, is one that I don't have all the answers to. We think we've made some really valuable recommendations, and we hope they'll be implemented, and that they'll be implemented for a longer view and not just, for the year or two to come.
Okay, so my follow-up to that is, one of the architects of the RNC situation, I think also Occupy Wall Street to a lesser degree, was Terrence Monahan. Now, I did not read every single word of your report, but I do note that you interviewed Terrence Monahan. Terrence Monahan, I believe, was also involved in that Mott Haven incident. This guy was cited specifically by CCRB back in 2006, I think it was, for overreacting during the RNC. And now here he is in charge of this. what does that say about the leadership of the New York City Police Department?
Yeah, I'm not going to comment on personnel issues at the police department. I think as a factual matter, you're right that Chief Mott Haven has been with the police department in leadership roles for a very long time and was the chief of the department at the time of these protests.
We have Ali Winston.
Hi there. Good morning. Commissioner, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Good morning, Ali. How are you?
I'm well. So this builds on the questions that Mr. Smith just asked you and some of the earlier remarks that you made about the Intelligence Division. So the Intelligence Division is under the Hanshu Consent Decree. Your investigation did review a lot of the state. It apparently reviewed the department's statements that they filled out when they conducted investigations into First Amendment activity. Did you review the propriety of those declarations as regarding the justification, the legal justification for NYPD monitoring First Amendment activity so extensively?
No, we did not look at that. Our focus in reviewing the intelligence documents was in what was leaving the Intelligence Bureau in terms of what intelligence might have informed policing decisions. One of the issues that we talk about in the report is that the public statements by both the mayor and the police commissioner at the time and subsequently really heavily emphasized the importance of intelligence to their policing decisions and to certain enforcement decisions. And so our goal was to understand, well, what were they being told? What did they rely on? And is that information that should inform our assessment of the validity and proportionality of the policing enforcement decisions that were made? So while, as you noted, we were given access to a lot of the underlying documentation to understand what intelligence the Bureau had and what they told to decision makers on the operational side, but we did not do an independent assessment of whether of the question you asked, whether that intelligence was appropriately gathered.
Thank you for that. And the follow-up I have is regarding the, again, going back to the broader issue, this report lays out serious structural problems, as you mentioned earlier, the refusal of the department to learn the lessons of 2004, Occupy Wall Street, in terms of crowd control, the disorder control unit. You make extensive mention of the strategic response groups, tactics and deployment, commands, and apparent inability to learn from their mistakes. This report has the structure of a pattern and practice investigation into civil rights abuses. Is this something that perhaps the NYPD does need, considering that there's no internal accountability from within the city and the mayor appears to be asleep at the wheel?
So a civil rights pattern and practice review is something I'm familiar with as a general matter, in particular from my time at DOJ, but that's not what DOI does. So I think it wouldn't be appropriate for me to opine on whether that's needed or not. I think we've shared our findings publicly, and that will be up to others.
We have Julianne Cuba from Streets Blog.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Good morning.
Hi, morning. So I have two questions. One, I know the report says it does not consider allegations of individual misconduct, but it does reference media reports about the two cops plowing their squad cars into a crowd. So is that just still under investigation by the AG? Did DOI look at that specifically?
So, we reviewed some of the evidence about that, but those matters are under investigation by others, including CCRB. And so, that was not, as I said, we have made every effort not to interfere with or undermine or cause difficulties for those ongoing investigations. And that would be one of them, yes.
Okay, may I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
So I've been trying to find, does the NYPD have any type of protocol, or specifically with the SRG squad, about how they can use their bodies or like bikes in any way to force a crowd? Like, is that something that DOI looks at, or is there any type of protocol for excessive use of force? Like, is that just something that's allowed?
So I think, if in the report, we do talk in a number of places about the policies of the police department and the training and policies of SRG in particular with regard to using barricades, using bicycles, other physical blockading movements, which, it's a complex issue because those tactics and techniques are appropriate in some circumstances. And the difficult question here is, were they used appropriately in these circumstances? And I think, we made a general finding that in our view, those tactics were overused, were used in a disproportionate way. But so yes, the NYPD does have policies and training about the use of those tactics, and they would be appropriate in some circumstances. And the difficult and complex question is, under what circumstances are they appropriate, and were they appropriate here?
Jose Pagliari from Univision.
Hi there, can everyone hear me all right?
Yes, I can. Good morning, Jose.
Commissioner, thank you for taking the time to do this. So I think the question I've got is about covering up the badges. I see that there's a section in the report that talks about the way that officers would, under the guise that they were, mourning other officers, would also cover up their badge numbers, thus, reducing transparency and frankly making it harder for journalists and the public to file any sort of complaints about abuse of force. So that section was pretty short, and I didn't see anything there in the recommendations or conclusions at the end. Can you talk a little bit about that factor in all this? Because I mean, it's one thing to talk about excessive force, but it's another to note the way that officers would make it difficult to identify them in the first place. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I think the starting point, Jose, and maybe the reason why we didn't make a specific recommendation on the badges is that the patrol guide already requires that all officers at all times have their badge number visible and that they identify themselves when asked. So that's an existing requirement in the police department already, and something for which, in theory, officers can be disciplined if they don't comply or be the subject of a complaint to CCRB or to IAB. And so, we focused on that issue in the report because not covering your badge number is already a violation. With what the department's response was to widespread reports that officers were covering their badge numbers during the protests. And we focus on exactly the issues you raise in terms of it's both an accountability problem for those who might want to complain, and also a messaging problem to the public and internally within the department that, instead of taking the moment to emphasize that accountability and transparency are values of the police department and are important for the public. As we note in the report, I think the department was largely dismissive of those reports in a way that was really a missed opportunity, both internally and externally.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to Marcia Kramer from WCBS. She indicated she had an immediate deadline, so we're just trying to accommodate Marcia.
Commissioner, I wondered when you, as a law enforcement person and someone who looked at the things that were going on in the NYPD, what was your reaction? Were you shocked? Were you dismayed? Were you, what was your reaction? And what would you say to the police commissioner who apparently had a police department that was unprepared to deal with these problems?
Yeah, Marcia, as you know, I've spent most of my adult life in law enforcement, and I will say that I've had just really extraordinary and extraordinarily valuable relationships over that time with the NYPD and with many outstanding individual detectives and police officers and supervisors. So, I think that we lay out pretty clearly in the report that, we found some serious deficiencies here in the response, that even while acknowledging the extremely challenging circumstances for the department, including extensive destruction of police property and injuries to police officers, some serious, that even factoring in that, which we tried to represent fairly, the response really was a failure on many levels. And so, I think that our hope is that the recommendations will be taken seriously and that the department will take responsibility for those failures and work to prevent them from occurring in the future. And I think some of those issues, as we said, are focused on the question of policing protests, but really point up larger issues within the department in terms of the focus of the training, the involvement of community affairs. Some of these issues extend beyond just the context of policing protests.
If I could just ask a follow-up, if you were going to talk directly to the mayor or talk directly to Police Commissioner Dermot Shea, what would you say to them about these findings, and what would you say to them about your expectations going forward?
Well, as I said, my main message is that I hope that they'll take the findings seriously and embrace the recommendations. I think many of our findings and recommendations go really to kind of core values of the police department. And I think things that we think embracing some of these values and their consequences is about strengthening the police department and helping the vast majority of good and dedicated police officers do their jobs better serve the community, improve the relationships between the police and the community, which will have positive effects on the way that police do every part of their job, not just policing protests.
Steve Burns from WCBS 880.
Morning, Commissioner. How are you?
Good morning. How are you? Steve, I'm having a little trouble hearing you. Can you speak up?
Yeah, how's this? Is this better?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, I'll speak up here. I just wanted to see if you could highlight a couple of passages here that I want to see if you could expand on a little bit. First of all, I noticed in the arrest statistics, the report mentions that there was a disproportionate number of felony charges issued to Black people. I wanted to see if you saw any other issues of racial disparity in your findings here, and what recommendations could apply to those kinds of issues.
Yeah, Steve, the one that you highlight there was a puzzle to us, and I think we wanted to include it in the report for transparency. As we know, felony arrests made up a pretty small proportion of the total arrests, I think around 8%. But in contrast to arrests as a whole, the racial disparity there was striking to us. And as we note in the footnote, we tried to do some further analysis, but given the number of factors that could play into that in terms of geographic part of the city, the circumstances of the arrest, the day or time that those arrests took place, the particular interaction between the arresting officer and the arrestee, we just were not able to, in this analysis, get behind what is behind that number. So, we have a lot of statistics about the demographic breakdown of arrests as a whole, which remained pretty consistent in the sense that around 45% of those arrested for any we use the police department's category of protest-related arrests. About 45% were white, around 35% Black, and around 12% Latino, and then a smaller proportion of other racial groups. So that remained pretty consistent, and that felony breakdown was something that stood out. So we thought it was important for transparency to include that.
Sure, and one other passage I wanted to see if you could expand on a little bit, where the report mentions that it went to NYPD officials to ask if, in retrospect, would you have changed anything about what you did, essentially? I'm paraphrasing a bit. And the NYPD had no suggestions. So I wanted to see what that tells you about the department's ability to do self-reflection and maybe look back and maybe change itself based on what it sees from that self-reflection.
Yeah, as we said, we asked every senior leader in the police department in our interviews whether, looking back from the time of our interview to these events, there's something that they would have done differently, should have done differently, think the department should have done differently. And as we note in the report, with very few exceptions, other than highlighting the staffing and that they would have had more staffing at the beginning, for the most part, the pretty consistent response was no, I think we did as well as we could have. And one of the things we wanted to highlight in the report is that it's a pretty wide gap between, I think, the general public perception among New Yorkers about how the department's response went, and that answer that things went as well as they could have, and there's nothing that they would have changed. So I don't know quite what to make of that. I hope that the department is more self-critical and self-reflective than those statements reflect. But yeah, I think it's a noticeable gap between those responses and I think the general public perception, both among participants in the protests and New Yorkers generally, about how the response went.
Next, we have Nick Pinto.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, Nick. Good morning. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you doing?
Good.
So I wanted to quickly follow up on that last question and just ask whether you've had, since the publication of the report, any further communication, or since that passage in the report was written, whether you've had any further communication with the NYPD to suggest that maybe they have given more thought to the situation and there are some things they'd change, and if not, how you sort of evaluate the prospects of the department changing some of these issues that you've identified without, if they're not prepared to acknowledge those mistakes.
I will say I think the department is taking the report seriously, and that I've not had any extensive conversation with the police commissioner other than him thanking us for the report and for our professionalism in the process, which I appreciate. As I've said, I think the report is well-founded and is serious, balanced, and fair, and I hope the department will take it seriously. And we certainly stand ready to engage in further discussions if that would be helpful.
All right. And then I also wanted to ask you, if I might, about the section of the report that touches on the Mott Haven incident, in which, as I read the report, the report sort of questions the overall wisdom of the way the NYPD handled that, but finds that viewed strictly through a lens of sort of the evidence that they had in hand, there was reason for doing what they did, and that they were within the law to arrest people for breaking curfew. And I just wanted to make sure that I was reading that correctly and ask you to sort of bounce that against some of the reporting we saw from the New York Post that called some of the underlying evidence into question, and the Human Rights Watch report, which found that many of the people arrested for breaking curfew were actually breaking curfew because they were detained and unable to leave starting before curfew.
Yeah, so I think what the takeaway from that is, and trying to present everything that we were able to learn in the investigation, is that I think the commander who made the decision to do that was motivated by legitimate policing concerns and informed by concerns from some portions of the community, as well as intelligence that suggested a need for a heightened concern about the potential for violence arising out of that planned protest. And we do note, which I think is fair and correct, that the police department had lawful authority to arrest anyone who was out of their home after the curfew that did not fall within the exceptions in the executive order. But I think we're pretty clear in noting that the extent of the decision to arrest, the way that it was carried out, and the force that was necessary to carry it out was, in our view, disproportionate, even taking into account our understanding of what decision makers knew and what they expected and what they were concerned about. So, I think we do take a somewhat different view than some of the other reports that have come out based on our review of the evidence, including internal police department documents. But, I think we share the concern that's been raised by some other reports about the disproportionality. And also, one of the issues we try to highlight is the effects of that and the way that the events were perceived, and how, in many ways, in these kinds of situations, perception is reality. It's perception does have substance, because the beliefs of the protest participants about how the police are behaving shape their behavior, and that's an iterative process between the police and protesters that in the end makes everybody less safe.
We have Jen and Fisher from Current.
Shannon, you're still muted.
I think Janan may be having some problems with his audio, so he had sent his question in just in case. So Janan, if you get your audio up, just let me know, but otherwise I will ask it if that's okay. He indicated there were reports by small business owners in Midtown, Soho, and on Fordham Road that police were not doing enough to stop the looting that happened on the same nights as the protests. Your report briefly addresses the Fordham Road looting, but only as it pertains to the protests. Why didn't the DOI look into the police responses to calls on looting? Why wasn't it in the report? Did you find any evidence to support a lack of enforcement of looting on those nights?
Yeah, so we didn't find any evidence to support a decision to not respond to looting. I think that, some of the circumstances with looting that was happening really are reflective of the staffing and manpower challenges that the police department was facing, in that in order to effectuate arrest, typically at least 2 officers are necessary per arrestee. And I think that the looting certainly, I think, caught the department by surprise. It's not something that we've seen in New York City in quite a long time. And that some of the response to the looting that happened during the protest period really is more reflective of staffing decisions and the challenges of understaffing that the police department was facing in terms of how they deployed officers during that period. So we did not find evidence of any decision or deliberate effort to not attempt to stop looting or respond to looting calls. We note in our report that during the peak days of looting, the 911 calls for commercial burglaries were many, many multiples above what you would see in a comparable time period during normal times.
Okay, we're going to move on to Laura Namias from the.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Laura. Good morning. I can hear you.
Okay. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Thanks. My question is about the access to records that you cite as a significant sort of systemic challenge for the independent or the oversight agencies. And I wondered, repeatedly through the footnotes in the report, it says that subpoena power ought to be reserved for non-city employees and shouldn't have to be used to compel anything from current city employees or from one executive agency against another. Did you have to use subpoena power to get any of the information that you used in the report? And if not, why not use it?
So,
to compel?
Right, we for this report, we did not have to use subpoena power. We used our DOI's own authority under the charter and NEO 16 to get everything that we needed from the police department and from other city agencies. And where we needed information from non-city agencies, we did not have to use subpoena power to get it. It's a complex legal question, Laura, which maybe is beyond the scope of this press conference, as to whether, DOI issues administrative demands to city agencies, and compulsion letters were necessary to get interviews with city employees. And that's just a different process than a legal subpoena process, which we use for third parties. And I think it's certainly an open legal question as to whether a subpoena in that sense would be enforceable as between two executive agencies of the same governmental unit. So that's a little bit of wonky lawyer talk, but a subpoena is as good as its enforceability. And that ultimately, if you needed it, would have to go to a court. And I think that's an open question. But in general, DOI has very extensive authority to get city documents and interviews, and that's what we use.
Could I ask one follow-up?
Sure.
For example, in one of the footnotes, it says that you were unable to get an interview with Fausto Pichardo. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Who I suppose had resigned at that point. The mayor, I think publicly this morning is sort of attributing some of the poor decision making to him. Did you give consideration or try any other means to get him to talk?
Yes, I mean, I think we gave consideration to the possibility of issuing him a subpoena once he no longer worked for the department. But ultimately, for timing reasons and related reasons, we didn't want to delay the report any further for that process, which can be lengthy. So, we exhausted every other means of attempting to get him to sit with us for an interview, and ultimately decided not to issue a subpoena to him. In light of our decision to get the report concluded and out.
Okay, just an update. We have about 5 folks left who have initial questions. Anybody who is looking to ask another follow-up after that, we would try to get to you at that point. Now we're going to go over to Ben Max from Gotham Gazette.
Hi, Commissioner. Good morning.
Good morning, Ben. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you doing? So I have a couple questions. A couple of the substantive things have already been asked. So I guess I have a couple process questions. One, can you say confidently and accurately to New Yorkers that the mayor's office and the NYPD didn't interfere with the timing of this report?
Yeah, that decision was made by DOI. No one else had any say in that besides me.
So why is it that on November 2nd, the mayor said the report was coming very, very soon, and now we're here on December 18th?
I don't know why he would say that.
Okay. The mayor, when announcing what he said was independent investigation, said it was going to be your office and the Corporation Counsel working together. What happened there, and why is this, being put out by DOI separate from the Corporation Counsel? Did the mayor misstate the origins of the investigation, or what happened on that front?
So Ben, I think if you look at the executive order, which is, the real document that governs this, I think what the order calls a joint review, it notes that it will proceed in 2 parts. One is an independent factual investigation by DOI, and a broader kind of policy review and factors review by the Corporation Counsel. So, I think pretty early on in the process, the Corporation Counsel and I both agreed and felt most comfortable with DOI doing what it does, which is pursuing, independent factual investigation and making findings and recommendations if we thought they were appropriate. And the Corporation Counsel kind of leveraging the particular skills and resources of the law department to do a somewhat different review, which I think they are continuing to work on. So throughout the process, Jim Johnson and I spoke regularly just to make sure that we weren't duplicating effort and to draw on each other's expertise. But the investigation proceeded independently by DOI. No one else was present for our interviews. We made all of the decisions and findings independently. And as that process concluded, what I felt most comfortable with was issuing our report as DOI's report, which is what we've issued today. So I don't think there's really a deeper story there, but I look forward to reading the Corporation Counsel's report when it comes out.
Okay, just because we're trying to get everybody in, we'll move on to Allie Watkins from the New York Times.
Hi there, Commissioner. Can you hear me?
I can, Allie. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I'm good. Thanks for having this. So this is kind of a unique moment to have this report come out because in some ways the NYPD has already had a chance to kind of correct flaws that it saw in its June and July response because they had some of these demonstrations in November, albeit much smaller. But there were obviously still a lot of reports of mass arrests and failure to discriminate between lawful protesting and unlawful protesting. And I'm curious if you can say anything, having seen the department respond now, I think the department even said that they had retrained a lot of officers. They had kind of deployed this new revamped strategy for some of the election week protests. I mean, are you optimistic about that? What were some of your thoughts kind of seeing this happen in smaller scale again in November?
Yeah, so, Allie, I don't want to go too far because I observe those events really as a citizen and we have not done an in-depth study of those events as we have of the events in late May and early June. But I think, we talk in the report about the new training that was rolled out. And as we note, I think you'd have to check with the police department, but, north of 10,000 officers did go through that new training. So, the plus there is having some consistency and some sense that everyone has some recent training that is consistent. But the rollout of that was stopped because of COVID concerns of having, close in-person training. And also, I think we have some fair criticisms in the report about that training is overly focused on kind of formations, crowd control, disorder control concepts, and not enough on what we think are some of the core issues, which is how the police department conceives of its mission vis-a-vis First Amendment expression, what mindset they bring to that work, and working to change that so that the mindset is one that really I think the department should embrace, that it is an honorable thing, a heroic thing for the department to be charged with the responsibility of making sure that New Yorkers can express their incredibly important First Amendment rights. And I think approaching it from that mindset and a mindset of facilitation, and how do we facilitate this to the greatest extent possible while also protecting public safety is going to require a real a change of approach. And that's where I'm not sure that has happened yet. And I think you see that in November.
And just to clarify, DOI you guys weren't having this kind of new revamped training conversation with them prior to November, or were you having that conversation through the summer?
No, I mean, the department certainly knew that we were examining the training based on our requests, and we were not able, although we requested a time to attend and observe the new training, it was shut down completely before we were able to do that. So we've seen some of the materials and talked to some folks about it, but we were not able to observe it ourselves before it was stopped for COVID concerns.
Next, we have Eric Umansky. I am so sorry if I'm getting that wrong, Eric, from ProPublica.
No, you nailed it. Thank you very much. So my question is around the commissioner's discretion over discipline, which I know the report addresses, but I'd just like to understand from you your conclusions. Fundamentally, should the commissioner maintain that absolute authority, or should it be constrained in some fashion?
Sure. I think that's an issue that we talk about in the report, but we don't come to any firm conclusion. I think, I try to approach this task with some humility and recognizing that we don't necessarily have all the answers, and where we do think we have definitive recommendations to make, we make them, and where we don't, we don't. So on this one, I think it's a very complex issue. Eric, I don't know how much you've looked at it yourself, but as an agency head myself, and I think even more so in the context of the police department, it is incredibly challenging to maintain, good order and discipline and control if you don't have the authority to discipline and the discretion over employee discipline. But I think, one huge challenge here is that many people in the community and in the public don't have confidence that the police and the police commissioner are meting out effective and appropriate discipline. So trying to figure out a system that doesn't necessarily strip the police commissioner of the ultimate authority for disciplining officers, but can embrace and figure out a way forward on this serious question of the public's doubts whether the discipline system is effective and fair. I think it's an incredibly complex problem.
If I could just follow up. Yeah, thank you. We actually have recently looked at this issue. We recently published a story that detailed how the police commissioner and previous police commissioners have frequently overturned even guilty pleas by officers, even judgments by the NYPD's own judges, and in cases that raise serious questions. So I'm trying to understand. I mean, it seemed to me the recommendations in there were for more discussion and more study, but why not? I mean, what is the argument for keeping it as the current system is, and what would be an alternative? I'm not quite sure I understand, what another option is that you are potentially laying out.
Yeah, I mean, I think, some of the other options that are under discussion would be to, for example, allow the CCRB's recommendations to have more binding effect on the police commissioner, to somehow have, some other system in which there's a, final say is given to someone else. But, as we looked at the issue, it's not obvious to me that that is a fix that doesn't bring with it its own problems. So, again, where we have confidence based on our study and review that we have a specific recommendation to make, we make it. And that wasn't one that we felt that, given the complexity of the issues, that we had an alternative recommendation to make at this time.
Rosa Goldenson from the city.
Hi, this actually follows up closely on that question. So it seems to me in the report you find that new oversight should not bind them to policy, practice, and procedure recommendations. Is that right? And I'm trying to understand, we have an ostensibly independent oversight in the OIG and the CCRB, and the big recommendation seems to be to roll them together into an agency that can better obtain documents. The question is, instead of an OIG, a CCRB, and that the PD can basically ignore, what would be so different about rolling them together into another independent agency that they can still ignore?
Well, look, I think, Rosa, in my view, for all of what DOI does is that, and I get asked about this a lot at the council and other places, is, should DOI in general, in all of our oversight roles, have the authority to make our recommendations binding on other agencies? And I think I've expressed this in other settings, at the council and otherwise, and again in the report, that I don't think that's how government works or how democracy works or should work when it comes to policy matters. So, I don't think the solution is to have another agency make those decisions for the police department. I'm not even sure how that would work, or how that would be a good idea. I think that the recommendations that we make here in terms of consolidating the authority for oversight into a single integrated agency is something that I do believe would improve and strengthen police oversight. There's not one thing that's a magic wand that can solve every problem, but I do believe that that would improve and strengthen the oversight of the police department.
And I don't know if you can still hear me, but why? With what kind of additional power? And you know, there's kind of there's two things, right? There's what you talk about with the kind of people's impressions of police impunity, which, you know, of course, people weren't just in the streets because someone died in Minnesota. It was also about that very kind of dynamic here, and the way things played out only sort of underline that for people in a lot of ways. So there's the impression people have, and then there's also the reality of oversight and of policies and practices changing and things being modified in response to oversight. So how would a consolidated agency change either of those things, both of those things?
Right, so, you know, I think as we lay out in the report, it's a couple of factors. One is making sure that the resources that are available for police oversight are used in the most efficient and effective way possible. The second is to enable a better interplay between kind of the individual complaint and misconduct investigations and systemic policy reviews, which really drawing on, I mean, that is really how DOI's oversight of every other city agency works, is an interplay between investigations of individual misconduct and systemic or policy reviews. You know, another factor we identify is the ability to conduct more effective public outreach and to receive the community's input and be a more effective bridge between the police department and the community, and a number of other things that we specify in that finding and the recommendations that arises from it. You know, I like to think that DOI is a pretty effective agency in overseeing other city agencies. Our recommendations are not binding, but they are overwhelmingly accepted by city agencies and have a real impact in improving the way the city works and in holding people accountable. So I just don't agree that making those recommendations binding is the only way to affect change or hold people accountable.
And finally, for this initial round of questions, we have the very patient Matt Shays from Newsday.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
I can, Matt. Good morning.
Hey, good morning, Commissioner. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Thank you for taking my question. I got two. The first is, to what extent contemporaneously did the PD, I'm talking about individual officers and as a whole, tell the truth about having issued warnings to disperse the factual bases for arrest, public statements, etc.?
So, you know, Matt, I think, you know, our interviews with the police department were conducted under oath, and I don't have any reason to think that people weren't truthful with us. You know, I can't say we've conducted a exhaustive comparison of what people have said to what we then found or was said to us. Again, some of that will come from the individual misconduct. You know, I think on your specific question about, you know, did people hear warnings, were warnings given? You know, I think one of the things we found in Mott Haven is that some warnings were definitely given over the loudspeaker system that the police department has, but you know, in a chaotic situation and the noise from helicopters and otherwise, that, you know, people's impression of what occurred and compared with video and audio and other evidence, you know, often varied considerably, which in my own experience, 20 years of doing investigations of all kinds, is not uncommon. That particularly in stressful and chaotic situations on both sides, that people's impression of what is happening in their memory later isn't always perfectly aligned. But you know, in our case, I think in our investigation, you know, we did find, you know, we looked to find the evidence about what warnings were given at what time and so on. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. We did not look at an individual level about, every person, what they were saying at the time versus saying now.
And my second question is, as recently as November, Juanita Holmes of the PD said that the department does not use kettling, that protesters are always warned before arrests. And so my question is, to what extent is that true historically and during the May-June Floyd protests?
Yeah, so I don't think that's accurate. I think some of the some of this back and forth about kettling or not was a insistence by the NYPD that they didn't use that term, kettling, which is, as far as we can tell, is true. That's not a term that was ever used by the police department, either in discussion or in their literature or training or whatever. But the concept of it, as I think it's generally understood in the public from these May and June events, is a tactic that's referred to by the NYPD as encirclement, which is essentially the same thing, to enclose a group of people within an area, barricades of various kinds, primarily for the purpose of when a group of people needs to be arrested or may need to be arrested. So, I don't know how much of the NYPD's response, is a semantics versus substance. The reality is they absolutely do use encirclement. It was used in the Floyd protests. It's been used in other situations by SRG. They're trained on it. It is a known and used tactic. So again, I don't know how much is about semantics and how much is about substance, but that same concept, which the NYPD calls encirclement, is a tactic on which they're trained and have practices on which they used in May and June.
Okay, I believe Diane Struzzi now has a question that was submitted to us in the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Nicole. Just before we get to the follow-ups, this is from Antoine from Fox 5. He would like to know, was there one area in your findings where you found that the NYPD went outside the guidelines more so than others?
Yeah, I don't know that there's any one area that I would highlight. I think I hope that people will take and read the report as a whole, that there's no question, as we try to make clear, this was an incredibly challenging policing situation, and in which, particularly in the early days, the police were dealing with a lot of violence, but that also, the response that they chose to, both the response that they defaulted to and the response that was made in response to decisions, was deeply problematic in a number of ways. So I'd hesitate to choose any one area that stands out as opposed to others.
Okay, it looks like we have a couple more follow-up questions. So I'm going to open it up to Nick Pinto.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Terrific. So just very quickly, I wanted to ask, in his prepared video response released this morning, the mayor said something to the effect of agreeing with some parts of your report more than others. And I was just wondering whether in your communications with him or his office, you'd gotten any insight into which parts of the report he agreed with more and which less.
No, I've not had that conversation with anyone, and I'll confess that I haven't seen the mayor's video. I was preparing for this, so I have not seen it, and I don't know what he's referring to. No.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to Ben Max.
Hi, Commissioner. Can you well, I guess I had one more quick question about the process, but then a substantive one. I'll just ask them both together if you could take both. But the first one was, I'm a little confused about the role of the NYPD Inspector General, and why he's not part of all this. And going back to the question of duplicative roles and such, I understand that office is within DOI, but I'm a little confused where he is and why his office hasn't seemed to be a bigger part of this. And then the second part was maybe if you wouldn't mind summing up for us and for New Yorkers, the degree to which you think that the police commissioner Shea lied to and misled New Yorkers in his public statements throughout the protests and the criticism of the protest policing, how you would sort of sum up how truthful he was and how much he misled the public?
So on your first question, Ben, I think that the OIG NYPD is a unit within DOI. It's not a separate entity. And, I decided early on that I wanted to, given the importance of this matter, be involved in directly supervising it myself. So as you can tell from the acknowledgements in the report, we assembled a team to do that was drawn from multiple parts of DOI, including senior staff that work within the OIG NYPD unit. That unit has many other matters that are ongoing that I thought it appropriate to not take the leader of that unit, Mr. Ure, away from that work, the many other projects that they have going. So that's how we decided to staff it, which is not unusual. I think if you look back in DOI's history, whether it's the massive Board of Elections report from 2012 or other major DOI undertakings, to kind of assemble a team that's particular for a special or complex or large project is something that's happened many times in DOI, and that's what I determined would be the right approach here, to include a number of senior knowledgeable staff from the staff of the PDIG. And on your second question, I'm not gonna quite buy into, I think, that framing. I'm not here to charge the police commissioner with making false statements or anything like that. I don't embrace that view of what happened. I do think, I think it's something that we emphasize in the report, that there were a number of real missed opportunities, and that many of the public statements about primarily emphasize restraint, that emphasize the violence on the part of the protesters, that meaning a claim, a framing that the actions of police officers exhibited restraint, and a framing around violence, and that really, I think, characterized the entirety of the protests as a disorder problem to solve, was really a disservice and a missed opportunity, and I think is reflective of the approach that the department took. There's an interplay between words and substance there, and so that, I think, is what we tried to focus on. That messaging is reflective of deeper issues within the department and how protest policing is conceived of, and that's something that there really is a path forward to change for the NYPD if they want to embrace it.
Okay, we're going to take two more follow-ups, and then I would just remind everybody, if you have additional questions, you can reach out to myself and to Diane, and we'll do our best to help you with those. So we're going to go over to Matt Shea.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Sorry, I just unmuted myself.
Yeah, we can hear you, Matt.
Commissioner, just two quick follow-ups. Did you find that there were any arrests, anyone who was arrested who shouldn't have been arrested, not as a matter of discretion, but as a matter of fact or law? So I'm thinking about protesters who were not violating the law, essential workers, et cetera. And then I have a follow-up.
So Matt, we did not, for this report, make individual findings at that level. I mean, you can see I hope the scale of the report, even for what it is, and to do that kind of individual level finding just was not something that was possible within the context of this report, and getting it out in a reasonable time frame for the public.
And just kind of a nuts and bolts question. How many protesters were injured? How many cops were injured? And can you describe the extent of the injuries of each?
So I don't have those total numbers at my fingertips, Matt, but if you look in the report, we do have those numbers there. We talk about the total number of officer injuries reported both on each day of of the peak protest events and in total for that period. And then, on the protester injuries, it's a much more complicated question, which we try to be transparent about in the report, that we have some records from the police department, for example, arrestees that requested medical attention. But those numbers end up not being really a full view into the protesters that may have been injured, in part because they only are targeted to arrestees. And as you can tell from the numbers that we talk about in the report, the total number of protest-related arrests in this period is in the neighborhood of 2,000. There were many more participants in the protest who didn't necessarily get arrested, might have been arrested and injured, but didn't report their injuries to the police during their arrest processing. So on the protester injuries, we really do not have good, reliable statistics. We put in the report what we do have and explain kind of the limitations of that data, but we did include that in the report, but it's a very limited picture into what the true number of protester injuries might be.
Okay, and finally we have Jake Offenhartz from Gotham.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, Jake.
Great. Thanks for taking these follow-ups, and I apologize if someone may have asked this before, but did you guys interview any protesters in the course of this investigation? And also, can you say whether the mayor had contacted you at all or anyone in the mayor's office during the course of the investigation?
Yeah, so we did not do extensive interviewing of the protesters, I think for a variety of reasons. One is that we did talk to many protest organizations and people who work in those organizations. And we certainly have reviewed as we know in the report, the AG public hearings, the council hearings, the many publicly, we did extensive kind of scraping of or a survey of social media, other postings, the traditional press coverage and so on. And I think in part that's a judgment about doing a random sampling of protester interviews. Would that produce anything beyond anecdotal information, beyond what we already were able to gather from this huge variety of sources? And ultimately, I think that would not have been more than additional anecdotal information in a very large universe that we already had of information of that character. And then I'm sorry, Jake, did you have a second question as part of that? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, my question was whether or not the mayor.
Oh, right, yes, no, the only communications that we have with City Hall during this period were if we needed assistance in navigating issues with the police department in terms of conditions of access or things like that, but otherwise, no.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate your interest in the report.